One of the successful surprise attacks that you studied were the 9/11 attacks. And you document really an incredible amount of advance warning going back for several years. And that's one particularly strong aspect of the book I found, where it's all in a very concise way, one after another. It's really quite compelling. And even more astonishing, how the policy makers didn't adapt to these increasing warnings. Why do you think the conventional wisdom that this was a failure of imagination is wrong?
Well, it is amazing, and I tried to put together, as you say in my book, all of the different warnings that we had before 9/11. And it's amazing, and on the one hand you might think, how is it possible that our nation's leaders didn't understand these warnings? But then I realized that almost all of those warnings were of this sort of broad, general, non-specific nature, what we call strategic warning. And usually our experts think we need strategic warning, but our decision makers didn't want to listen to it. In fact, there's one case where the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, they have their own intelligence organization, and their intelligence analysts put together the dots. They assessed that there was a real significant threat to terrorists associated with Al-Qaeda, perhaps, using airplanes as bombs. But they didn't have any specific facts to back it up. You would still think that the FAA, that organization within our government, would be the most willing to listen to warnings like that. But even the FAA leadership wasn't willing to do anything about that when all it was analysis. They hadn't been able to get inside the Al-Qaeda plot and give specific warning. So it's not that strategic warning that's really needed. What instead we need is even better collection, which is tougher on a specific threat, and that's what we didn't have before 9/11.
Could it also be that the amount of warning, the repetitiveness of the warning actually dulled its effect?
We do see that happen fairly often. In other studies of intelligence failure, such as the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983, there were lots of warnings, dozens of warnings, in fact, of the possibility of car bombs, for instance, against our facility there. And they did dull the warning. In fact, the Marine leadership said afterward that, hey, we didn't need anybody else telling us to watch out. We were watching out as much as we could. What we didn't have in that case was we didn't know who to watch for. We didn't know what kind of specific threat to have happen. And that's what also happened before 9/11. So again, I think we talk about connecting the dots, that we like to think that's what the 9/11 Commission said. We need to connect the dots better. I think we need to collect the dots much more specifically. We need much more fine-grained intelligence if we're going to use that intelligence to stop bad things from happening.
And when you say fine-grained, do you mean focusing the intelligence effort?
I do. In fact, that gets into a topic that often people talk about today, sort of big data, collection of large data sets. And what I found is it's not big data that prevents bad things from happening. It's little data. It's really fine-grained intelligence. In fact, you usually need, for a terrorist plot, you need someone inside that plot. You need to actually know what precisely a decision maker can do to prevent that.
And one of the concerns I've raised about big data is that the more data, the more alarms get set. Maybe lower level alarms, but more alarms. And in your discussion of the 9/11 attacks was the possibility of false alarms, the fact that so many of these hair-raising incidents didn't actually come to fruition. I remember in the FBI in 1999, in the run-up to the millennium, there was all sorts of concerns, and you document in the book that all sorts of groups were going to take advantage of the dawn of the new millennium to have attacks. And then when there weren't any, the next warning was maybe a little less likely to be heeded. Is that a possibility?
Well, that's certainly something that we see in intelligence all the time. And in fact, that's one of the important ways that intelligence for domestic purposes, homeland security issues, is different from national security intelligence, in the sense that to some extent when you're focusing your intelligence assets outward toward the rest of the world, toward outward enemies, false alarms, false positives don't matter quite as much because, we're on alert anyway, and a sort of wrong report about a potential foreign enemy that doesn't come to fruition may not be that dangerous, that bad. But when that false report is about a domestic person, domestic organization, not only do you risk overwarning your decision makers, who then become numb to those warnings, but possibly you've blamed or you've accused an American citizen of doing something that they weren't trying to do. So it's a double problem domestically.